Henry Calloway sat in the dimly lit briefing room, his sharp eyes scanning the classified files spread across the table. The scent of stale coffee lingered in the air, mixing with the scent of ink and paper. The weight of his next mission settled over him like a lead vest. Across from him, Special Agent Rick Dawson tapped his fingers against a thick manila folder, his expression grim. "This is it, Calloway. Your biggest job yet," Dawson said, flipping open the file. A black-and-white surveillance photo of Patrick O'Malley, Boston's most notorious crime lord, stared back at Henry. The man's face was carved from stone, with piercing eyes that spoke of decades of calculated brutality. O'Malley was untouchable. Any attempt to bring him down had ended in bloodshed and missing witnesses. Henry leaned back in his chair, his jaw tightening. "So what's the play? How do we get close enough to take him down?" Dawson slid another photograph forward. This one was different. The woman in the image had long auburn hair that tumbled over one shoulder, full lips that seemed perpetually smirking, and striking green eyes that didn't just look at the camera but through it. "Quinn O'Malley," Dawson said. "His daughter." Henry studied the image, his mind already calculating the risks. "She's the key? She's the only way in." O'Malley keeps his business airtight, but he has one soft spot, and that's her. She's got no direct involvement in his operations, but she's still under heavy guard. If you can get close, gain her trust, you'll have access to information no one else does. "And how do you expect me to do that?" Henry asked, already knowing the answer. "We've arranged for you to be hired as her personal bodyguard," Dawson said. "You'll use the alias Henry Nash, former military, a specialist in close protection, recruited through one of O'Malley's trusted fixers. You'll be vetted, so keep your story tight. If they sniff you out, you won't make it out alive." Henry exhaled slowly, his fingers drumming against the edge of the file. It wasn't the first time he'd gone undercover, but something about this one felt different. Maybe it was the woman staring back at him from the photograph, her gaze unreadable. Dawson leaned in. "You get in. You watch. You gather intel. And whatever happens, you do not get involved with her. She's not part of the job, O'Malley is." Henry didn't answer. He just closed the file and nodded. 2 days later, Henry walked through the grand entrance of O'Malley's estate. The mansion was a fortress, high walls, security cameras at every angle, and armed guards stationed at key points. The scent of cigar smoke and whiskey drifted through the marble-floored halls, a testament to the power held within these walls. He'd been through the vetting process, passed the tests, and now he was standing in enemy territory. A man in a crisp suit led him through the estate, his eyes unreadable. "Boss is waiting for you," he said. "Don't fuck this up." Henry didn't respond. He'd been in the presence of men like O'Malley before. They respected silence more than words. Inside the study, Patrick O'Malley stood behind a mahogany desk, pouring himself a glass of whiskey. The air was thick with the scent of aged scotch and the faint hint of gunpowder. The crime lord looked up, his sharp gaze assessing Henry in an instant. "You're the new guy," O'Malley said, his voice low and even. "Yes, sir," Henry replied, keeping his tone firm but respectful. O'Malley nodded slowly. "You come highly recommended. Ex-military. Private security for high-profile clients. Why do you want this job?" Henry didn't hesitate. "I protect people. I don't ask questions. I get the job done." O'Malley smirked, swirling his whiskey. "Good answer." He gestured toward the doorway. "She's outside. Let's see if you can keep up." Henry turned as the door swung open. And there she was. Quinn O'Malley. She wasn't just beautiful, she was intoxicating. Auburn waves cascaded over her shoulders, framing a face that was both elegant and defiant. She wore a sleek black dress that hugged her curves, the slit along her thigh a silent rebellion against her father's rules. But it was her eyes that held him, green, piercing, and filled with something close to amusement. She crossed her arms, her gaze trailing over him before she arched a brow. "This is my new babysitter?" Henry suppressed a smirk. "Bodyguard." "Same thing," she mused. "Are you any good, or did my father hire another stiff who's just going to get in my way?" O'Malley let out a low chuckle. Give him a test, Quinn. See if he's worth keeping. Henry barely had time to react before Quinn lunged. Fast. Unpredictable. Her leg swept out, aiming for his ribs, but he sidestepped, catching her wrist mid-motion and twisting just enough to throw her off balance. She recovered quickly, twisting out of his grip and landing a sharp jab toward his stomach. He blocked it, grabbing her wrist again, only this time, he pulled her flush against him. The moment stretched. Her breath was warm against his neck, her scent, a mix of jasmine and something dangerously sweet, wrapped around him. Her lips curved upward, her eyes dancing with amusement. Well, she murmured. You might actually be useful. Henry released her, stepping back. Glad to have your approval. O'Malley laughed, clearly entertained. She's a handful. Keep her in check, keep her safe, and I'll consider you worth the money. Henry inclined his head. Understood. Quinn smirked as she brushed past him, her fingers grazing his forearm just lightly enough to make it clear she was going to be trouble. And for the first time in his career, Henry had the sinking feeling that this job wasn't just going to test his skills. It was going to test his control. And he wasn't sure he'd pass. The days that followed his hiring were routine, at least on the surface. Henry kept to his role, shadowing Quinn O'Malley as she moved through her meticulously scheduled life. Breakfasts at the estate, afternoons at the gym, dinners at exclusive restaurants, her routine was carefully orchestrated, a reflection of the control her father exerted over every aspect of her existence. But it didn't take Henry long to see it, the restlessness beneath her polished exterior, the frustration simmering just under the surface. She was caged, and she hated it. She tested him in subtle ways. Small acts of defiance, little slips from the prescribed routine. A sudden detour while shopping, an unexpected exit out a side door instead of the main entrance, a moment where she disappeared just long enough to make him sweat. She wasn't careless, but she was determined, pushing at the edges of the world her father had built around her. And Henry, for all his training, found himself constantly anticipating her next move. So when he realized she was gone one night, her security detail clueless, her car missing, he wasn't surprised. Annoyed? Yes. Worried? Absolutely. But not surprised. Tracking her wasn't difficult. She wasn't trying to disappear, just to escape. Her destination was clear, Velvet, one of the most exclusive clubs in the city, a place where the powerful played and the dangerous prowled. It was the exact kind of place where she shouldn't be, where rivals of her father's empire would recognize her in an instant. Henry made it inside without issue, moving through the crowd with practiced ease. The music pulsed, a heavy bass beat vibrating through the air, neon lights casting an electric glow over the dance floor. It didn't take long to spot her. Quinn stood at the bar, dressed in something short, silky, and entirely inappropriate for someone with a target on her back. A cocktail in hand, she was laughing at something a man beside her was saying, some rich kid, oblivious to who he was standing next to. Henry pushed through the crowd, reaching her just as she tilted her head back to take another sip. His hand wrapped around her wrist, firm but not painful. Time to go, he said, his voice cutting through the music. She turned, green eyes flashing with amusement, not a trace of fear. You always this bossy? Henry leaned in, his grip unwavering. You have no idea. She exhaled a soft laugh, the corner of her mouth quirking up in challenge. I was just having a drink. You were making yourself a target, he countered. His gaze flicked around the room, scanning for threats. Too many eyes on her already. Let's move. She sighed, clearly unimpressed by his concern, but she didn't resist as he pulled her away from the bar. They wove through the throngs of bodies, slipping out through a side exit into the cool night air. The alley was narrow, damp from an earlier rain, the sounds of the club still pounding behind them. Henry released her wrist, stepping back, but the fire in her eyes told him this wasn't over. You don't get to drag me around like I'm some helpless little girl, she said, arms crossing. You don't get to act like your name doesn't come with a price on your head, he shot back. You think O'Malley's enemies don't know who you are? You walk into a place like that alone, you might as well paint a target on your back. Her chin lifted, defiance sharpening her features. I didn't ask for your concern. He took a step forward, closing the distance between them. You don't have to. It's my job to keep you breathing, and I take my job seriously. The tension crackled between them, thick and charged. Her breathing was measured, but he could see the way her pulse quickened at her throat, the way her fingers curled slightly, as if she wasn't sure whether she wanted to push him away or pull him closer. You don't scare me, Henry, she murmured. Good, he replied. I'm not here to scare you. I'm here to keep you alive. For a moment, neither of them moved. The air between them pulsed with something dangerous, something neither of them could quite name. Then, gunfire. The crack of bullets shattered the tension, the unmistakable pop of a drive-by shooting slicing through the night. Henry didn't think, he acted. 1 second, Quinn was standing in front of him. The next, he had her pinned to the wall, his body covering hers as bullets ricocheted off the brick. A car sped past, tires screeching, the muzzle flash of automatic weapons visible for only an instant before the vehicle disappeared into the night. Quinn's breath came fast, her hands gripping his arms as she tried to process what had just happened. Henry scanned the street, making sure the immediate danger was gone before easing back just enough to look at her. Are you hit? He asked, his voice edged with steel. She shook her head, wide-eyed. No. You. Fine. He exhaled, releasing her fully but keeping his body between her and the street. We need to go. Now. This time, she didn't argue. They moved quickly, Henry keeping her close as they made their way to his car, parked a block away. He got her inside, scanning for tails as he pulled into the road, his pulse still hammering from the adrenaline. Silence stretched between them for a few minutes before Quinn spoke. That wasn't random, she said, her voice quieter than before. No, Henry agreed. That was a message. She swallowed hard, staring out the window. Who do you think it was? Could be anyone, he admitted. Your father's enemies. Someone looking to send a warning. Someone looking to start a war. Her fingers curled into the fabric of her dress. I shouldn't have gone out. You shouldn't have, he agreed. She turned her head toward him then, studying him in a way that made something inside him tighten. You saved my life. It's what I do. She tilted her head, lips pressing together as if weighing her next words carefully. Then, softer than before, she said, Thank you. For the first time since meeting her, she wasn't teasing, wasn't challenging. There was no arrogance in her voice, no playful defiance. Just quiet gratitude. Henry kept his eyes on the road, gripping the wheel tighter. Don't make me do it again, he said. But even as the words left his lips, he knew it wouldn't be that simple. Quinn O'Malley was trouble. And trouble had a way of making a man forget all the rules. The tension between them shifted after the shooting. Something unspoken lingered in the air, thick and electric. Henry had saved her life. That was an undeniable fact. And while Quinn had always been reckless, she wasn't stupid. She knew she needed him. But that didn't mean she would make it easy for him. Their uneasy truce took on an edge, one laced with challenge, amusement, and something far more dangerous. She tested him at every turn, pushing boundaries with an almost calculated precision. It started subtly. A lingering glance, a brush of fingers when he handed her a drink, a deliberately slow adjustment of her dress strap when she knew he was watching. He ignored it. At least, he tried to. She wasn't just beautiful, she was intoxicating. The kind of woman who could unravel a man before he even realized he was tangled in her web. And Henry knew better. He had a mission, a job to do, and getting involved with her wasn't just reckless, it was suicide. But Quinn O'Malley had never met a rule she wasn't willing to break. One evening, after another routine security check of the estate, he found her waiting for him in the lounge, sprawled lazily on a leather couch. A glass of red wine dangled between her fingers, her long legs crossed in a way that was both elegant and teasing. You're always so serious, she mused, tilting her head. Don't you ever relax? Henry didn't break stride as he moved toward the security panel near the doorway. My job isn't to relax. My job is to keep you alive. She hummed, sipping her wine. And is that all you care about? My survival. He turned his head just enough to meet her gaze. That's what I'm paid for. A slow smile played at her lips, one that told him she wasn't convinced. Then I must say, I feel very protected. He didn't take the bait. He never did. But inside, it was getting harder to ignore the way she affected him. Their verbal sparring became a daily routine, but Henry learned more than just her ability to play games. He saw glimpses of the real Quinn, the woman beneath the carefully crafted facade. She hated the life she was trapped in. She didn't crave power like her father, didn't take pride in the empire he'd built. If anything, she resented it. One night, as they stood on the balcony overlooking the vast estate, she let the truth slip. You know what the worst part is? She murmured, staring out at the distant city lights. Everyone assumes I'm like him, that I enjoy being a part of this world. But I never had a choice. Henry watched her, the wind teasing strands of her auburn hair across her face. Why stay? She let out a short, humorless laugh. Do you know what happens to people who try to leave my father's world? She turned toward him, green eyes locking onto his. They don't get very far. There was a quiet resignation in her voice that made something tighten in his chest. She wasn't just a spoiled princess playing dangerous games. She was a woman caught in a web too intricate to escape. That should have made it easier to keep his distance. Instead, it made it harder. The shift between them came during one of her self-defense training sessions. After the shooting, Henry had insisted on regular drills, teaching her how to handle herself in a fight. Quinn was a natural, fast, flexible, and utterly relentless. But she also saw it as another opportunity to challenge him. That night, they were in the private gym, the space dimly lit, shadows stretching across the floor. Henry stood across from her, arms crossed, watching as she stretched. She wore black leggings and a fitted sports bra, her toned stomach on display, her movements smooth and deliberate. Come on, Nash, she said, rolling her shoulders. Let's see what you've got. Henry exhaled, stepping onto the mat. We're going over defense today. She smirked. Afraid to take me on? He didn't answer, just motioned for her to come at him. She moved fast, aiming a sharp kick at his side. He dodged, catching her ankle and twisting just enough to throw her off balance. She recovered quickly, shifting tactics, feinting left before aiming a strike at his ribs. He blocked effortlessly, his grip firm but not cruel. Sloppy. She huffed, determination flaring in her eyes. Again. They moved in a dance of motion and precision. She attacked, he countered, each move sharper than the last. Then, she changed the game. Instead of pulling back after her next strike, she pivoted and pressed into him, their bodies colliding. He stumbled back a half step, surprised. Her breath was warm against his neck, her hands gripping his shoulders for balance. He could feel her heartbeat against his chest. Fast. Wild. You're holding back, she whispered, eyes gleaming with challenge. His fingers tightened on her waist before he forced himself to let go, stepping back. This isn't a game, Quinn. She didn't move, still close enough that he could see the rise and fall of her chest, the heat in her gaze. Feels like one to me, she murmured. And I think you're losing. His jaw clenched. She was pushing him, deliberately, mercilessly. And the worst part was, she wasn't wrong. He was losing. Because for all his control, for all his discipline, there was one undeniable truth creeping into his thoughts. He wanted her. Not as a mission. Not as a means to an end. As a woman. And if he wasn't careful, he wouldn't just lose the game. He'd lose himself. The art gala was a spectacle of wealth and power, the kind of event where every smile concealed an ulterior motive. Men in tailored suits and women in shimmering gowns moved through the grand hall, sipping champagne and exchanging pleasantries laced with hidden threats. The venue, a lavish museum in the heart of the city, was packed with politicians, business moguls, and more than a few criminals hiding in plain sight. Quinn O'Malley fit in effortlessly. Draped in an emerald green gown that clung to her curves, she moved through the crowd like she owned the room. Heads turned when she passed, some with admiration, others with caution. She was her father's daughter, after all, and that name carried weight. Henry stayed close, dressed in a sharp black suit, his stance relaxed but alert. He wasn't here to admire art or sip overpriced whiskey. His focus was solely on her, every movement, every glance, every possible threat lurking beneath the surface of polite conversation. Quinn, of course, made it difficult. "You look like you're about to pull a gun on a waiter," she mused, swirling her champagne as she cast him a smirk. "Relax, Nash. We're at a party." "We're at a target-rich environment," he corrected, scanning the room. "Big difference." She sighed, tilting her head. "You take the fun out of everything." He was about to respond when something shifted in the air. A ripple in the crowd. A glance exchanged between two men in the far corner. Then, he saw them. 3 figures moving toward Quinn, their steps calculated, their expressions too neutral to be casual. Henry moved before they did. The first man reached for her arm, and Henry was there in an instant, twisting the attacker's wrist back at a brutal angle. A sickening crack filled the air, followed by a strangled scream. Chaos erupted. The second man lunged, a blade flashing in the dim lighting. Henry deflected the attack, grabbing the wrist mid-strike and slamming his elbow into the man's throat. He collapsed, gasping for breath. Quinn's eyes widened as the third assailant pulled a gun, but Henry was faster. He grabbed her waist, spinning them both just as the shot went off, the bullet grazing past where she had been standing moments before. Without hesitation, he launched forward, slamming the attacker's head against the marble column with enough force to drop him instantly. Security swarmed the scene, but it was already over. Henry tightened his grip on Quinn's hand, pulling her toward the exit before the situation could spiral further. They didn't stop running until they reached the car. Inside the penthouse, the silence was deafening. Henry locked the door behind them, his pulse still thrumming with adrenaline. Quinn stood in the center of the room, arms wrapped around herself, staring at nothing. "You're okay," he said, voice low, steady. She exhaled a short laugh, but there was no humor in it. "Funny, I don't feel okay." He studied her. The tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers gripped the fabric of her dress just a little too tightly. She was shaken, but she wouldn't admit it. Quinn O'Malley never let anyone see her vulnerable. "You don't have to pretend with me," he said. She turned, arching a brow. "Is that right? Because last I checked, you're just my bodyguard." Henry stepped forward, closing the space between them. "Yeah? Then why am I the only one you're letting see you like this?" Her breath hitched, but she covered it quickly. "Don't flatter yourself, Nash." But the bravado was cracking. He could see it. He moved past her, heading toward the bar. "You need a drink." "I need a new life," she muttered. He poured whiskey into a glass, holding it out. She hesitated before taking it, fingers brushing against his. A bead of silence stretched between them. The air was thick, charged. Then she spoke again, voice softer. "Stay." He stilled. "What?" She downed the whiskey, setting the glass aside. "I don't want to be alone tonight." Henry swallowed hard. This was dangerous territory. Being close to her was already a risk. Staying here? After everything? He should have said no. Should have walked away. Instead, he nodded. The night stretched on, the weight of what had happened settling between them. She changed into something more comfortable, an oversized sweater that slipped off one shoulder, exposing smooth skin. She curled up on the couch, watching the city skyline through the glass walls. He stayed nearby, leaning against the bar, watching her. "You're staring," she murmured. "You're tired." She sighed. "But I can't sleep." He knew the feeling. Without thinking, he moved closer, settling beside her. The warmth of her body, the faint scent of jasmine and whiskey, it made him forget, just for a moment, what he was supposed to be doing. Her head turned slightly, gaze meeting his. "Why do you do it?" she asked. "The bodyguard thing." "It's not about the job," he admitted. It's about protecting people who need it. And you think I need protecting? He didn't answer because they both knew the truth. The space between them disappeared. Her fingers brushed against his jaw, a feather-light touch that sent heat spiraling through him. She was testing him again, but this time, it wasn't a game. His control slipped. His hand found her waist, fingers pressing lightly against the soft fabric of her sweater. She leaned in, lips parting slightly, waiting. Then, reality crashed in. With a sharp inhale, he pulled away. Quinn. Her eyes searched his, frustration flickering beneath the desire. Why do you keep fighting this? Because it would ruin everything. Because she wasn't just another woman. Because he was lying to her. He clenched his fists, forcing his breathing to steady. Because I have to. She exhaled, disappointment flashing across her face before she masked it with a smirk. You're a better man than I thought. He shook his head. No, I'm just a man who knows when to stop. She studied him for a long moment before finally leaning back against the couch. Suit yourself, Nash. He turned away, fists still clenched. He hadn't crossed the line tonight. But she knew, just as well as he did, that it was only a matter of time. The investigation was slow but steady. Henry had spent weeks ingratiating himself into O'Malley's world, quietly gathering intel while keeping his cover airtight. Late-night calls with his FBI handler were brief and coded, carefully orchestrated to avoid detection. He documented everything: transactions, shipments, whispered conversations behind closed doors, but the real prize, the undeniable evidence to bring O'Malley down, still eluded him. The only thing progressing faster than the investigation was his entanglement with Quinn. She was everywhere, filling the spaces of his mind even when she wasn't near. It wasn't just her beauty, it was her fire, her defiance, the way she saw through every calculated move he made. She didn't trust easily, but with him, her guard had lowered, little by little. And he had let her in more than he ever should have. They talked more now. Not just in passing quips or flirtatious challenges, but real conversations. Late at night, when the world quieted, she spoke about her father's sins, not in a way that excused them, but in a way that revealed just how much she hated the world she had been born into. He controls everything, she admitted one evening, sitting on the balcony of the penthouse, legs tucked beneath her. My life, my decisions, hell, even the people I talk to. I'm nothing more than an asset to him. Henry leaned against the railing, watching her. So why stay? A humorless chuckle escaped her lips. Because leaving isn't as simple as packing a bag and disappearing. People don't walk away from this life. They get buried in it. She looked up at him then, and something in her eyes made his chest tighten. Do you ever feel trapped, Henry? He should have lied. Should have told her that he didn't understand, that his life was simple. But he wasn't sure what was more suffocating, the mission or the fact that, for the first time in a long time, he was beginning to care about someone he was supposed to be using. Yeah, he murmured. I do. She didn't ask why. Instead, she reached for the bottle of whiskey beside her, took a slow sip, and passed it to him. They sat there in silence, staring at the city skyline, two people caught in a world neither of them belonged in. The masquerade ball was an event of power and excess, a gathering of the city's most dangerous men wrapped in the pretense of sophistication. It was being held in a grand estate just outside the city. Marble floors, chandeliers that dripped with crystal, and masked figures draped in expensive silk and lace. Henry blended into the crowd with ease, dressed in a tailored black suit, his mask a sleek design that obscured just enough of his face to maintain mystery. He was there to observe, to listen, to uncover any whispers that might lead to O'Malley's downfall. But then Quinn walked in and everything else faded. She wore deep red, the kind of dress that made the entire room take notice. The satin clung to her, accentuating every curve, the slit riding high up her thigh with each step. Her mask, adorned with delicate gold filigree, covered just enough to make her look otherworldly, like something out of a dream. And God, was she a dream? She spotted him instantly, a knowing smirk playing at her lips as she approached. You clean up well, Nash. You don't look too bad yourself, he admitted, unable to stop his gaze from trailing over her. She tilted her head. You're staring. You want me to? Her eyes darkened, lips curving slightly. Careful, Henry. You're starting to sound like you want to break your own rules. Before he could respond, she reached for his hand. Dance with me. It wasn't a request. He hesitated for only a second before letting her pull him onto the dance floor. The music was slow, seductive, the kind that made it impossible to maintain distance. Her body pressed into his, her scent intoxicating. You're supposed to be watching the room, she murmured, her fingers tracing along the back of his neck. Not me. You're in the room, he replied, voice rough. Her lips curled. Flattering. But we both know that's not why you're looking at me. She was teasing him again, testing the limits of his restraint. But tonight, the lines were thinner, the distance between them barely existing at all. Her fingers slid down his arm, her breath warm against his ear as she whispered, What's it going to take to make you crack, Henry? His grip tightened around her waist. You shouldn't play games you don't want to win. She laughed softly. Who says I don't want to? The tension snapped. Before he could stop himself, before logic could override desire, his lips crashed against hers. It was fire, raw and unrestrained. She gasped into the kiss, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she melted into him, fingers tangling in his hair as he deepened it, drinking her in like a man starved. The world around them blurred, the music, the crowd, the mission. None of it mattered. His hand slid down her back, pressing her closer, his body burning where it met hers. She was soft and demanding all at once, matching him kiss for kiss, no hesitation, no doubt. It was reckless. It was dangerous. And it was inevitable. Then, reality slammed back in. With a sharp inhale, he broke the kiss, his forehead resting against hers as he fought to regain control. Her breathing was uneven, her lips swollen from the force of their kiss. Tell me you don't want this, she whispered. He swallowed hard. I can't. She exhaled, fingers still gripping his suit. Then why are you stopping? Because he was lying to her. Because he was going to destroy her father. Because this was never supposed to happen. But he didn't say any of that. Instead, he took a step back, jaw clenched. Because if I start, I won't stop. Her gaze flickered with something unreadable before she schooled her expression back into something amused, guarded. You're a frustrating man, Henry Nash. He forced himself to smirk. So I've been told. She studied him for a moment longer before turning away, disappearing back into the crowd. Henry exhaled, running a hand through his hair. He was in deep. Too deep. The shift came subtly at first, like a crack in glass too fine to notice until it spread. O'Malley had always been a careful man, but now he was watching Henry closer, his cold eyes scrutinizing every move, every word. Trust had never been freely given in this world, and Henry knew he was reaching the point where suspicion could turn deadly. Then came the test. The order was given over dinner, in a quiet, almost casual tone that barely ruffled the air between bites of steak and sips of whiskey. There's a man, O'Malley said, setting down his fork, his gaze leveling on Henry. A rat. Low level, but dangerous in the way vermin always are. Henry didn't move, didn't react. He had spent years perfecting the art of indifference. O'Malley leaned back, fingers tapping against the arm of his chair. I want you to handle it. The message was clear. There would be no further discussions, no second chances. Henry was being asked to prove himself in the most final way possible. Quinn was at the far end of the table, pretending not to listen, but he saw the way her fingers gripped her wine glass just a little too tightly. She knew what her father was asking. She also knew he would do it. Or at least, she thought he would. The target was easy to find, an informant in O'Malley's network, nothing more than a desperate man who had made the mistake of talking to the wrong people. Henry tracked him down in a dingy warehouse on the outskirts of the city, where the man had holed up, waiting for a fate he likely knew was coming. Henry held the gun steady, the weight familiar in his hand, but he didn't pull the trigger. Instead, he faked the kill. A single shot, buried in the wall behind the terrified man's head. The informant would disappear after that, fade into the void with a warning never to resurface. But it was close. Too close. And when Henry returned to the estate, he could feel the shift within himself, the weight of the choices he had made pressing down. Quinn noticed. She said nothing at first, simply watching him, her sharp gaze peeling back layers he didn't want exposed. But she wasn't the kind of woman who let things slide. That night, a storm rolled in, thick clouds swallowing the sky, rain hammering against the windows. O'Malley, ever cautious, had sent Quinn to a safe house outside the city for the night, just in case. Henry was sent with her. The place was secluded, a rustic cabin built for function, not comfort. A single generator-powered light flickered dimly, casting long shadows along the wooden walls. The fireplace was empty, the air inside cold. Quinn kicked off her heels, pouring herself a drink from the bottle of whiskey she found in the kitchen. She didn't bother offering him one. "You're quiet," she said, taking a slow sip. More than usual. He didn't respond right away, removing his jacket and draping it over a chair. She studied him, eyes narrowing slightly. "Something happened today." He looked at her then, the flickering light reflecting in her emerald eyes. "Nothing I can't handle." She let out a soft, humorless laugh. "That's not an answer." He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "It doesn't matter. It does if it's eating at you." Her voice was quieter now, the teasing edge replaced with something real. Concern. He should have walked away, should have shut down the conversation before it went too far. But something in her gaze, something raw and unguarded, held him there. "You don't want to know the things I've done," he murmured. She took a step closer. "You think I don't already?" The air between them crackled, thick with unsaid words, unspoken truths. The storm outside raged on, wind howling against the cabin, but inside, the world felt smaller, more suffocating. "You've been different since the gala," she said. "Since that kiss." He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to hold steady. "You're running from something, Henry," she pressed, her voice dropping lower. "Or maybe you're running from someone." His fingers curled into fists at his sides. "You don't know what you're talking about." She stepped even closer, so close he could feel the heat radiating from her. "Don't I?" she whispered. His resolve snapped. 1 second, there was space between them. The next, she was in his arms, their mouths crashing together in a kiss that was nothing like the one before. This wasn't a stolen moment on a crowded dance floor. This was raw, desperate, a fire that had been smoldering for too long and finally erupted into an uncontrollable blaze. She gasped against his lips as he backed her up against the wooden wall, hands gripping her waist with just enough force to make her shudder. Her fingers tangled in his hair, pulling him closer, as if she needed him just as much as he needed her. His jacket hit the floor. Her sweater followed. Every touch was a brand, every sigh a silent confession of things they couldn't say aloud. He traced a path down her spine, memorizing the way she trembled beneath his hands, the way she arched into him like she had been waiting for this just as long as he had. But then, reality clawed its way back in. Henry tore himself away, chest rising and falling rapidly as he struggled to catch his breath. Quinn's lips were swollen, her hair a mess, her eyes dark with frustration and something deeper. "Don't you dare pull away from me again," she warned. His hands clenched at his sides, every muscle in his body screaming to ignore the voice in his head telling him to stop. "I can't do this," he forced out, his voice raw. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You already did." He shook his head. "No, not like this." Her jaw tightened, anger flashing across her face before it was replaced with something colder. "Fine," she said, reaching down to grab the sweater from the floor, slipping it back over her head. "Run all you want, Henry. But we both know you'll come back." She was right. And that terrified him more than anything. Henry sat alone in the dimly lit safe house, elbows resting on his knees, staring at the dying embers in the fireplace. The air still smelled like her, jasmine, whiskey, and the remnants of something dangerously sweet. His body ached from the way he had held her, from the fire that had burned through him the moment he finally let himself touch her. And now, regret curled around his ribs like a vice. She was supposed to be a means to an end. A way into O'Malley's world. A mission. But with every lingering glance, every challenge in her voice, she had become something else. Something he couldn't afford to want. The storm had passed, leaving behind a stillness that pressed against him like a weight. He scrubbed a hand over his face, forcing himself to push away the memory of her bare skin beneath his fingertips, the way her breath had hitched when he whispered her name. It was a mistake, and he had to make sure it didn't happen again. When she emerged from the bedroom later that morning, she was already dressed, her expression unreadable. She didn't acknowledge him right away, moving through the small kitchen, pouring herself coffee as if last night hadn't changed everything. Finally, she glanced at him. "You look like you've been up all night." He didn't respond. She took a slow sip of her coffee, eyes never leaving his. "Are we doing the whole brooding silence thing? Because I have to say, it's getting old." His jaw clenched. Last night shouldn't have happened. A small smile played at the corner of her lips. It did, though. He exhaled sharply, pushing himself to his feet. "We can't do this, Quinn." She tilted her head. "Then don't." He frowned. "What?" "If you regret it so much, don't let it happen again," she said, completely unbothered. "You're the one who keeps fighting this, Henry. Not me." He opened his mouth, but no words came. She was right. She always was. Instead of arguing, he grabbed his jacket and walked out. O'Malley was waiting when he returned to the estate. The crime lord sat in his private lounge, a cigar smoldering between his fingers, watching Henry with the kind of stare that could unnerve lesser men. "You handled yourself well the other night," O'Malley said, exhaling a curl of smoke. "I like a man who can think on his feet." Henry didn't let his guard slip. Compliments from a man like O'Malley were never without expectation. "I need someone I trust overseeing a shipment," O'Malley continued. "Weapons deal. High stakes. You up for it?" This was it. A direct invitation into the darker side of O'Malley's empire. The kind of thing that would put Henry exactly where he needed to be. And exactly where he shouldn't be. He nodded. "I can handle it." O'Malley smirked. "I thought you might say that." Henry left the room knowing two things: his cover was deeper than ever, and he was running out of time. That night, Henry met with his FBI handler in a secluded parking garage, the air thick with the scent of oil and concrete. "You're slipping," Dawson said, voice tight. "You're in too deep, Calloway." Henry leaned against the hood of his car, staring at the shadows stretching across the pavement. "I'm fine." "Bullshit." Dawson took a step closer, lowering his voice. "We're seeing cracks in your reports. Delays. Gaps. And then there's the girl." Henry's muscles tensed. "She's part of the job." Dawson let out a humorless laugh. "Yeah? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like she's becoming something else." Henry didn't answer. "Listen to me," Dawson continued. "We can't afford mistakes. This mission is bigger than whatever the hell is happening between you two. You need to get your head straight before this whole thing goes to hell." Henry exhaled slowly, the weight of everything pressing down. "I know what I'm doing." Dawson didn't look convinced. "Then prove it." Quinn knew something was wrong the moment Henry walked through the doors of the penthouse. He had been different since the safe house, more guarded, more distant. And tonight it was even worse. She was sprawled on the couch, a book open in her lap, but she barely glanced at the pages. Instead, she watched him, the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw clenched as he moved. "You ever going to tell me what's going on in that head of yours?" she asked casually. Henry didn't look at her. "Nothing's going on." She snorted. "Yeah, sure. And I'm the Queen of England." He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. Quinn set the book aside and stood, stepping closer. "You don't talk much, but you're not exactly subtle." "Something's wrong." His gaze flicked to her then, something unreadable flashing across his face before he schooled his expression. "It's nothing you need to worry about." Her lips pressed together. "I hate that line." He sighed. "Quinn." No, she interrupted, frustration lacing her voice. I'm done with the excuses. I know when someone is lying to me, Henry. And you? You've been lying since the day we met. His stomach twisted. She shook her head, crossing her arms. You don't have to tell me everything. But don't insult me by pretending like I don't see what's happening. He wanted to tell her. God, he wanted to tell her everything. But if she knew the truth, she'd hate him. So instead, he said nothing. She sighed, stepping back. Fine, keep your secrets. She turned, heading toward the bedroom, but she paused in the doorway. You know what the worst part is? She asked quietly. He swallowed. What? I think I could have trusted you. And then she was gone, leaving him alone with the crushing weight of his own lies. The night was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt heavy, like the air carried too many unspoken words. Quinn had lived in that silence her whole life. It was the pause between threats, the moment before someone pulled the trigger, the weight of things people refused to say. But tonight, the silence felt different. It wasn't just her father's world pressing down on her, it was Henry. Something was wrong. She had noticed it for days now. The way his jaw tensed when she spoke. The way his gaze lingered on her like he was memorizing something he had no right to keep. The distance between them had never been greater, even though he was always near. So when she overheard him on the phone, voice hushed, sharp in a way she had never heard before, something inside her shifted. She hadn't meant to eavesdrop. The door to the study had been cracked open just enough for her to hear him. He wasn't the type to take calls in the house, he was careful, always watching. But tonight, he had slipped. I don't have long, he muttered into the phone. Quinn lingered in the hallway, her fingers tightening into fists. A pause. Then, O'Malley's making a move soon. I'll get what you need. Her pulse pounded. Who the hell was he talking to? Another stretch of silence. Then his voice again, low, firm. She can't know. The air left her lungs. She stepped back before she could hear any more, before she gave herself away. Her stomach twisted, a sinking weight pulling her under. She didn't know exactly what Henry was hiding, but she knew enough. She had been right all along. He was lying to her. She left before he could see her. Before the anger, or worse, the hurt, showed on her face. Later that night, she sent him a message. Meet me on the rooftop. He responded immediately. Be there in 10. The rooftop was her escape, a place her father rarely thought about, and the only space in the estate that truly felt like hers. She had furnished it with things that made her feel like a person, not just Patrick O'Malley's daughter. Soft blankets, dim lanterns, a collection of books no one but her ever touched. Tonight, she sat on the ledge, looking out at the glittering city skyline, trying to steady herself before Henry arrived. When she heard the door open, she didn't turn. He was quiet as he approached, his presence solid, grounding. You okay? He asked. She exhaled slowly. I don't know. A beat of silence stretched between them before he moved closer. You wanted to see me. She finally turned, studying him. He looked the same, calm, unreadable, frustratingly composed. But there was something in his eyes, something raw, as if he knew she had figured out something he wasn't ready to face. Yeah, she said softly. I did. She reached for the whiskey beside her, pouring 2 glasses. When she handed him one, their fingers brushed. He hesitated for a fraction of a second before taking it. You ever think about leaving? She asked, staring at the skyline. He was silent for a long moment. All the time. She looked at him then, really looked at him. Why don't you? His grip tightened around the glass. Some things aren't that simple. She swallowed hard. No, they're not. The air between them was thick, heavy with things neither of them was willing to say. But Quinn was tired of pretending, tired of playing games she never asked to be a part of. She set her drink aside and reached for him. He stiffened, just for a moment, before letting her pull him closer. Her fingers traced along his jaw, feeling the tension there, the weight he carried in silence. You don't have to pretend with me, she whispered. His eyes darkened. You think I'm pretending? She didn't answer. Because he wasn't. He was fighting something himself, whatever secrets he refused to say aloud. But in this moment, none of it mattered. She kissed him. Soft at first, testing, waiting. Then he broke. His hands gripped her waist, pulling her against him, his mouth claiming hers in a way that made her dizzy. There was no hesitation now, no restraint. It was raw, desperate, like he was trying to burn away whatever was between them before it destroyed them both. She arched against him, her breath hitching as his lips traced a path down her throat. His fingers slipped beneath the hem of her dress, skimming along her bare skin, and she shivered. "Henry," she whispered. He groaned, pressing her back against the cushions, his body covering hers. Every touch was fire, every sigh a silent confession. He was unraveling, just as much as she was, and she didn't care about the consequences. She wanted this. She wanted him. For once, she wanted something that had nothing to do with her father, with power, with the world that had shaped her into someone she barely recognized. And Henry was the only thing that had ever felt real. His lips brushed against hers again, softer this time, almost reverent. But beneath it, there was something else. Something that felt like goodbye. Her chest tightened. He pulled away just enough to look at her, his thumb tracing the curve of her cheek. His expression was unreadable, but she felt the shift. "Don't do that," she murmured. His brows furrowed. "Do what? Look at me like that." "Like what?" She swallowed hard. "Like you're already leaving." He didn't answer. She reached for him again, but this time, he caught her wrist, stopping her. And just like that, the spell was broken. The air was suddenly colder, the reality creeping back in like an unwelcome guest. She pulled away, wrapping the blanket around herself. "You should go." His jaw clenched, as if he wanted to say something, but he didn't. Instead, he stood, lingering for only a second before heading toward the door. She watched him go, her chest aching with something she refused to name. Because she knew now. She didn't know the full truth. But she knew enough. Henry was lying to her. And soon, she would find out why. Quinn sat in her father's study, a glass of whiskey in her hand, but she barely tasted it. The room was quiet except for the rhythmic ticking of the antique clock on the wall, its steady beat at odds with the chaos in her mind. For days now, something had been gnawing at her, clawing at the edges of her thoughts. That night on the rooftop had only made it worse. Henry had looked at her like he wanted to say something, like he needed to, but he hadn't. Because he couldn't. And now she understood why. The conversation she had overheard between him and the unknown voice on the other end of that call had haunted her ever since. The pieces of the puzzle had been scattered for weeks, but now they were forming something solid, something undeniable. Henry was hiding something. Something big. And tonight, she was going to find out exactly what. When he entered the penthouse later that evening, she was waiting. He froze the moment he saw her. One look at her face and he knew. "You know," he said, voice quiet. She took a slow breath, setting down the glass with deliberate precision. "Who are you really, Henry?" His jaw tensed. He didn't answer right away, and the silence only made her anger burn hotter. "Don't lie to me," she warned. "Not anymore." A muscle in his jaw twitched. "It's not that simple." Her fingers curled into fists. "It never is it?" He took a step toward her, but she stood her ground. "Tell me the truth," she demanded. "Right now." His lips parted, but no words came. She could see the war in his eyes, the push and pull of whatever it was he was about to say. And then, "I'm FBI." The words were a gunshot to her ribs. She inhaled sharply, the weight of them sinking in, dragging her under. FBI. Henry wasn't just lying. He wasn't just some bodyguard. He was the enemy. Her throat tightened. You were using me." His face twisted, pain flashing through his expression. "It wasn't Quinn, it wasn't like that." A bitter laugh escaped her lips. "Oh! Then what was it like?" He took another step closer, his voice rough. "It started as a mission, yes. But it became more than that." She shook her head, bile rising in her throat. You made me trust you. I didn't plan for that, he admitted. I didn't plan for you. Tears burned in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She swallowed hard. You made me love you. His breath hitched. But she didn't wait for his response. She grabbed her coat and stormed toward the door. Quinn, he called after her. Don't do this. She didn't stop. She had to get out. She had to go to her father. The drive to O'Malley's estate was a blur, rage and betrayal twisting inside her like a storm with no end. She had trusted him. Let him in. And he had been lying to her the entire time. Her father was in his private lounge when she arrived, whiskey in hand, surrounded by his closest men. He raised a brow at her unexpected entrance. Quinn, he mused. To what do I owe this visit? She opened her mouth, but then she hesitated. Telling her father would mean one thing. Henry would die. And yet, hadn't he earned it? Hadn't he played her for a fool? Hadn't he deserved whatever hell was coming for him? She swallowed hard. If she spoke now, it would be a death sentence. And despite everything, despite the betrayal, despite the lies, she wasn't sure she could do it. Her father studied her, sharp and assessing. Something wrong, love? She forced a breath. No. He didn't look convinced, but he let it go. For now. She left, her heart hammering in her chest. But she was too late. Because when she stepped outside, Henry was already there. And so were her father's men. They had him surrounded, guns drawn, his face unreadable as they forced him to his knees. Her stomach dropped. Well, O'Malley murmured, stepping outside behind her. Seems we have ourselves a little rat. Quinn couldn't breathe. Her father circled Henry like a predator, amusement flickering in his expression. You really thought you could fool me? Henry didn't answer. O'Malley chuckled, shaking his head. And here I was, starting to like you. Quinn felt frozen, trapped in a nightmare she couldn't escape. Kill him, her father said simply. Panic surged through her. No, she blurted before she could stop herself. O'Malley's gaze snapped to her. Silence fell. Excuse me, he said, voice dangerously low. Quinn forced herself to stand tall. Not here. Not like this. Her father studied her, and she knew what he was doing. Calculating. Weighing. She had never questioned him before. Never fought back. And he would wonder why she was doing it now. She had to be careful. Had to be smart. So she swallowed the fear in her throat and said, a public execution would send a stronger message. O'Malley's head tilted, amusement flashing through his eyes. Then, after a pause, smart girl, he mused. He turned to his men. Lock him up. We'll make a show of it tomorrow. Henry's gaze met hers as they dragged him away. He didn't beg, didn't plead. But his eyes held something that shattered her completely. Because she knew he wasn't looking at her with hate. He was looking at her like he understood. Like he forgave her. And that was the worst part of all. The cold metal dug into Henry's wrists, the tight ropes cutting into his skin. Blood dripped from a fresh cut along his temple, his head pounding from the last hit they delivered before throwing him into the small, damp basement beneath O'Malley's estate. The air was thick with mildew and sweat, the dim lighting barely casting enough of a glow to see the concrete walls surrounding him. He exhaled through his nose, testing the restraints. They held firm. Henry wasn't afraid to die. He had accepted the risk the moment he took this assignment. He knew what men like Patrick O'Malley did to traitors. There would be no quick execution, no simple bullet to the head. No, O'Malley would make a show of it, use Henry as an example. But even as he sat there, battered and bound, it wasn't death that haunted his mind. It was her. Quinn. The look in her eyes when her father had ordered his execution had been a gut punch. She had been betrayed, shattered, furious. But she had hesitated. She had saved his life, at least for now. The heavy iron door creaked open. Footsteps echoed off the walls, slow and deliberate. He expected O'Malley's men, expected another beating before the main event. But then he saw her. Quinn stepped inside, her silhouette sharp against the dim light filtering in from the hallway. She was still in the deep emerald dress from the night before, but now it was wrinkled, slightly disheveled, like she had been pacing for hours. She shut the door behind her, but she didn't move forward. He didn't speak. Neither did she. Then, finally, "You really are FBI." Her voice was quiet, almost flat. Henry swallowed, his jaw tightening. "Yes." She exhaled sharply, shaking her head as she crossed her arms over her chest. "You lied to me." He let out a bitter chuckle. "I never had a choice." Her gaze snapped to his, sharp as a blade. "You always had a choice." He held her stare, his throat tight. "If I told you the truth from the start, you would have never let me in." A humorless laugh escaped her lips. "And that would have been better than this?" She gestured around them. "You're tied to a chair about to be executed, and I have to decide whether or not to let it happen." His stomach twisted. "I never wanted this for you." She scoffed, stepping closer. "Don't act like this is about me. You came into my life to destroy my father, and I was just a convenient way in." "No," he said immediately. "It wasn't like that." Her eyes darkened. "Then tell me, Henry. Tell me the truth." He hesitated. She reached for the gun tucked into her waistband, clicking the safety off. "Tell me, or I walk out that door and let them finish what they started." He believed her. So he told her everything. He told her about the years he spent undercover, about the endless nights building trust with men he wanted to take down. He told her about the operation, about the evidence he had gathered, about the deals he had been documenting. And he told her about her father. Not just the crimes she already knew, but the things she hadn't seen. The bodies buried, the people silenced, the betrayal that ran so deep it was impossible to untangle. By the time he finished, she was trembling. She turned away, her breathing uneven, the gun still clutched in her hand. "You should hate me," he said quietly. She let out a short, bitter laugh. "I do." But her voice cracked. He closed his eyes for a moment before opening them again. "Then why are you still here?" She didn't answer. Instead, she raised the gun and shot the guard standing just outside the door. The body hit the ground with a thud, blood pooling beneath him. Henry stared at her. "Quinn." "Shut up," she snapped, already moving toward him. She grabbed a knife from the dead guard's belt, cutting through his restraints with quick, sharp movements. The ropes fell away, and Henry sucked in a breath, flexing his stiff fingers. "You didn't have to do that," he murmured. She ignored him. "We have about 90 seconds before someone hears that shot. Can you walk?" He nodded. His body ached, but adrenaline was already kicking in. She shoved the gun into his hands. "Then let's go." They moved fast. Through the corridors, through the back entrance, avoiding the cameras she knew so well. The estate was a fortress, but Quinn knew its weaknesses. When they reached the outer gates, Henry took out the 2 guards posted there with quick, precise shots. Then they were in the car, speeding away into the night. The city blurred past them, neon lights flashing through the windshield. Quinn's grip on the wheel was tight, her knuckles white. Neither of them spoke. Not until they reached the motel on the outskirts of town. The room was small, dingy, but it didn't matter. It was safer for now. Quinn paced as Henry sat on the edge of the bed, wincing as he pressed a hand to his side. Finally, she stopped. "You're still going after him?" Henry looked up. "You know I am." Her hands curled into fists. "What happens to me when you do?" His throat tightened. "I don't know." She let out a harsh breath, shaking her head. "God, I am so fucking stupid." He stood, stepping toward her. "No, you're not." She lifted her gaze to his, eyes blazing. "Then tell me, Henry, was any of it real?" His chest ached. He reached for her hand, but she pulled away. He exhaled sharply. "Yes." She swallowed hard. "Tell me." He stepped closer, closing the space between them, voice low, rough. "You were never just a mission, Quinn." "Not for me." She sucked in a breath, but he wasn't done. "I fell for you," he admitted, the words breaking something inside him. "And it's killing me." Her lips parted, but no words came. Instead, she did the only thing that made sense. She kissed him. Hard. Desperate. And Henry knew, in that moment, that even if the world burned around them, he wouldn't let her go. The weight of what they were about to do settled between them like a storm ready to break. Henry sat on the edge of the motel bed, double-checking his weapon while Quinn paced near the window, her mind racing with everything that had led them here. Her father needed to be taken down. That much was clear. But what came after? She had spent her whole life living under his rule, learning to navigate his world, convincing herself she was untouchable. Now, she was about to burn it all down. Henry was watching her. She could feel it. "You don't have to do this," he said quietly. She turned to him, her expression hard. "Yes, I do." There was no turning back. She had already betrayed her father the moment she helped Henry escape. The moment she put a bullet in one of O'Malley's men, her choice had been made. Now, she had to finish it. Henry exhaled, his jaw tightening. "Then we do this together." She nodded. Together. They had a plan. A dangerous one. Quinn had spent years by her father's side, and she knew where he kept his records, hidden in a private office, inside a vault only a handful of people even knew existed. If Henry got inside, he would have all the evidence he needed. And O'Malley would finally fall. They arrived at the compound just before midnight. Quinn knew the guards by name, knew their habits, knew how to slip past them without setting off alarms. She led Henry through the side entrance, her heart hammering as they moved through the halls, the scent of cigar smoke lingering in the air. It felt different tonight. Like the house knew it was about to turn into a battleground. They reached the office. The vault was inside. Henry moved fast, setting up a small device to crack the lock. The seconds stretched painfully long, tension coiling in the air. Quinn kept watch, gripping her gun so tightly her fingers ached. Then, a click. The vault opened. Henry worked quickly, snapping photos of the ledgers, the transaction lists, the records that would bury O'Malley once and for all. He stuffed a flash drive into his pocket, then turned to Quinn. "We have it." She nodded, forcing herself to breathe. Now came the hard part. Facing her father. O'Malley was in the lounge, just as she expected, sitting in his leather chair with a glass of whiskey in hand. He looked up as they entered, his eyes flicking between her and Henry. He smiled. Well, he mused, swirling his drink. Look who finally grew a backbone. Quinn's pulse pounded, but she held firm. "It's over, Dad." O'Malley let out a low chuckle. "Is it?" Henry stepped forward. "We have everything we need to bring you down." The amusement in O'Malley's eyes darkened. "Do you now?" Quinn forced herself to keep her voice steady. "I'm not your pawn anymore." Her father exhaled through his nose, setting down his drink. "That's disappointing." The room exploded into chaos. Gunfire rang out, shattering the glass behind them. Quinn dove for cover as bullets sprayed through the room. Henry returned fire, dropping one of O'Malley's men before taking a shot to the shoulder. He gritted his teeth, staggering, but didn't stop. Quinn grabbed a weapon from the fallen guard, her hands steady despite the adrenaline flooding her veins. She fired, hitting another of her father's men before pulling Henry toward the exit. "We have to go," she shouted. He nodded, pressing a hand to his bleeding shoulder. They ran. The compound was a war zone, gunfire echoing down the halls as more of O'Malley's men swarmed. Quinn knew these walls, knew the way out, but her father had planned for betrayal. He had planned for her betrayal. Guards blocked the front exit. No time to think. Henry raised his weapon, firing a shot that shattered the chandelier above them. It crashed down, sending glass and metal raining onto the guards. They made it to the garage. Henry yanked the door open, shoving her inside before climbing in himself. Quinn slammed her foot on the gas, the tires screeching against the pavement. They were almost clear. Then she saw him. O'Malley stood on the front steps of the compound, watching them go. He didn't chase. Didn't shoot. Just smiled. Quinn's stomach twisted, but she didn't stop. They had won. But at what cost? The FBI swarmed the compound within the hour. Quinn and Henry sat in a safe house miles away, listening to the news report. Patrick O'Malley, kingpin of Boston's underworld, arrested in a federal raid. It should have felt like victory. Instead, Quinn felt numb. She had destroyed everything. Her father, her past, the life she had known. Henry sat beside her, his shoulder bandaged, exhaustion weighing heavy on his features. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "You did the right thing," he said. She swallowed. "Then why doesn't it feel like it?" He didn't answer. Because they both knew. Nothing about this had ever been simple. The rhythmic sound of the waves crashing against the shore was the only thing grounding Quinn in the present. The sky stretched in hues of gold and lavender, the sun sinking slowly into the horizon, casting its warm glow across the vast ocean before her. The salty breeze tangled through her auburn hair, teasing it across her face as she stood barefoot in the sand, staring out at the endless expanse of water. She had come here to think, to breathe, to figure out who the hell she was now. For the first time in her life, there were no chains holding her down. No looming shadow dictating her every move. She was free. So why did she feel so goddamn lost? The beach house she had rented under a fake name sat a few yards behind her, tucked into the dunes, secluded enough that she could disappear if she wanted to. And maybe that had been the plan. For the past few weeks, she had been drifting, floating through empty days without purpose, without direction. She had spent years defining herself in contrast to her father's world, rebel, manipulator, survivor. Now that it was gone, she had no idea what was left of her. The rest of the world had moved on. News reports dissected Patrick O'Malley's downfall, painting him as a criminal mastermind, a ruthless kingpin. Some stories whispered about the betrayal of his daughter, the one who had delivered the final blow. She had done the right thing. She had saved people. She had broken free. And yet, the ache in her chest hadn't faded. The questions hadn't stopped. A voice cut through the hush of the evening, rough and familiar. "Didn't take you for the type to disappear." Her breath hitched. She closed her eyes for a second before turning. "Henry." He stood a few feet away, hands shoved into his pockets, watching her with the same intense gaze that had always unraveled her in ways she never wanted to admit. He looked different, yet the same. The bruises had faded, but there was still a stiffness in the way he held himself, a tightness in his jaw. She swallowed against the rush of emotions clawing their way up her throat. "Didn't take you for the type to chase." He took a step closer, the sand shifting beneath his boots. "I don't chase." A ghost of a smirk tugged at her lips. "Yet here you are." Silence settled between them, but it wasn't heavy like before. It was filled with something else. Something unspoken. She studied him, the way his eyes searched hers, the way he carried himself as if he wasn't entirely sure what he was doing here. "Why are you here, Henry?" He let out a breath, shifting his weight. "You tell me." She tilted her head, heart hammering against her ribs. "Maybe I wanted to see if you'd come." His lips quirked in that infuriating way. "And maybe I wanted to see if you'd let me stay." She turned back toward the ocean, hugging her arms around herself. "I don't know what happens now." A beat passed before he spoke. "Neither do I." She scoffed, shaking her head. "That's a first." He took another step closer, close enough that she could feel his warmth. "I spent years knowing exactly what I had to do. Every move calculated, every step planned." His voice dipped lower, rougher. "And then I met you." Quinn exhaled slowly. She wasn't ready for this. Or maybe she was. She turned to face him fully, searching his expression. "You still ruined everything." A muscle in his jaw ticked. "I know." Her chest tightened. "I hated you for it." "I know that too." Her throat constricted. "But I still can't walk away." Henry reached out, his fingers brushing against her wrist, tentative, uncertain. "Then don't." It was simple. But nothing about them had ever been simple. She let out a shaky breath, every wall she had built threatening to crumble. "I don't know how to start over." His fingers curled around her wrist, firm but not demanding. "We figure it out." She studied him, the way his eyes softened, The way he held her like she was something breakable, even though they both knew she was anything but. And then, finally, she let go. She surged forward, crashing into him, her arms wrapping around his neck as she pulled him into a kiss that had been waiting too long to happen. It wasn't soft. It wasn't slow. It was desperate, fierce, filled with every ounce of frustration, longing, and need that had been simmering between them from the start. Henry groaned against her mouth, his arms locking around her waist as he pulled her flesh against him. His fingers slid into her hair, tilting her head to deepen the kiss, to claim, to take. She melted into him, letting the world fall away. It didn't matter how they started. Didn't matter that it had all been built on lies, on deception, on a mission that should have ended with them on opposite sides. Because this was real. He pulled back just enough to press his forehead against hers, his breath ragged. "Tell me you're sure." She let out a shaky laugh, her fingers gripping the front of his shirt. "Henry, I was sure the first time you looked at me like I was a person, not a weapon." His grip tightened. "Then let's get the hell out of here." She smiled, for the first time in what felt like forever. They had no plan, no destination, no idea what came next. But they had each other. And that was enough. They turned toward the horizon together, walking toward whatever came next. Something unknown. Something new. Something theirs. The end.
Thank you so much for watching. All my stories are written by me, and I hope you enjoy them. I upload new videos daily, so I hope you'll hit the like button and subscribe to my channel. I'd also love to hear what you think about this story in the comments, and feel free to tell me what kinds of stories you'd like me to bring to the channel in the future.